What do Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, and Queen Victoria all have in common? The very simple answer to this question is that they all at one point in time were the absolute rulers of the most massive and powerful empires ever to exist in this world. At the height of the Macedonian Empire, they controlled all of Greece, had subdued the Thracian kingdom, and overthrew the Achaemenid Empire. Alexander the Great was the sole ruler of the Macedonian kingdom at this point in its history, making him an immensely powerful figure. Genghis Khan and his Mongolian Empire held control over parts of Russia, parts of Ukraine, and held control over whole countries in Asia. Genghis Khan also held control of one of the most powerful armies in the world at this point in time. Queen Victoria and her British Empire had colonies and subjects all across the world, including, but not limited to, India, Ireland, Canada, and New Zealand. The British Empire was no doubt one of the largest empires to ever grace the earth, and had an enormous amount of military and political power. This is not the only thing these leaders had in common, however. All three of these empires of leaders were semi-successful monarchs. The Macedonian Empire fell not long after the death of Alexander. After the death of Genghis Khan, the Mongolian Empire was disassembled and a portion of it was given to each of one of his sons. Roughly 44 years after the death of Queen Victoria, the British Empire began to crumble. Neither the Macedonians, nor the Mongols, nor the British Empire were able to stand the test of time. Each one of these empires had at least one mutiny against them at one point in their prime time. How were these monarchs able to quench the mutinies and feelings of discontent amongst their subjects? The most effective method was to convince their subjects that the empires were improving the life of them, and that the subjects would not be in as good of a place as they would be without the empires. Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, and Queen Victoria all used the age-old adage of "the enemy of my enemy is my friend" to help maintain their power over their subjects and calm any discontent there may be. Section 1. Alexander the Great at Opus. Ancient leaders, especially Alexander the Great, were also able to quell discontent amongst his people. In 324 BCE, upset about Alexander's Persian dress and acceptance of Persian troops in his army, and appointment of leadership titles to Persian nobles, his Macedonian troops grew to feel as though Alexander was not caring for his Greek soldiers. He held a speech at Opus, which is now modern-day Iraq, and spoke elegantly about how he had given them so much, and that by leaving and deserting him, they would have a bad reputation back in Greece, one without honor. Alexander said they would be branded as disloyal and ungrateful for all of the wealth and prosperity he had given them. Alexander let his conquered Persian peoples rule themselves, but had their leaders swear fealty to him. This policy of indirect rule allowed for less resources to be spent on keeping forces in cities too much and made it easier for him to rule foreign lands. Where Alexander had troubles keeping control of his own troops, Genghis Khan did not have that issue. It was about who Genghis Khan chose to conquer that was his problem. Section 2. Genghis Khan against the Jin dynasty. Not unlike Alexander's troops, Genghis's own generals were fiercely loyal to him, and his army was also extremely organized. His generals were handpicked by him, called tumans, commanded 10,000 troops at a time, with smaller captains that commanded each 100. Then each platoon would be split into 10 men. This decimal system allowed for increased maneuverability and created loyalty to their commanding officers. Any deserters that would leave a band of 10 men weren't chased down, but the remaining soldiers in their platoon of 10 would be killed. This created a sense of platoon loyalty and forced a fierce devotion to the army and their band of tens. Genghis Khan's army from 1210 to 1213 BCE raided the countryside of the Jin dynasty of China. The capital of the Jin was Zhongdu, later named Beijing, and was besieged in 1213 CE. Genghis planned to starve out the city, but his troops came down with the plague and were forced to negotiate with the Jin Emperor Xuanzong. Xuanzong swore fealty to Genghis Khan, giving him horses, loot, men, and his own daughter. Genghis Khan pulled all of his forces out of China, and once he had gone past the Great Wall, he received a message that the emperor moved his court further southward at Kai-Fen. This enraged him and returned to Zhongdu, besieging the city once again with the help of thousands of Chinese engineers. Genghis gave the order to breach the city and burn it to the ground. For weeks, thousands of carts of loot were sent back to Mongolia. The fires of what would become Beijing burned for over a month, while its people were massacred. Genghis planned on letting China be a puppet state with their own emperor at its center, but Xuanzong forced his hand. China was under direct control of the Khanate by 1214 CE. Later, after conquering all of the western lands of his empire and putting down any ideas of rebellion of his vassal kingdoms, Genghis fell from his horse and injured his shoulder. He developed a fever and died at the age of 66 in 1229. Thankfully, unlike Alexander, he had planned for succession and forced his 4 sons beforehand to swear to keep his empire together after his death, and put forth a series of laws that kept his empire from falling apart. His sons were given lands, each to their own, and could rule as they see fit, as long as they expected whoever would become Khan. His son, Ogadai, ruled the region of China and became the Great Khan, changing the Mongol Empire from a tributary to a tax-based empire which had a postal service, paper currency, which created civil service exams open to everyone while implementing a culture of religious tolerance. This shift from nomadic to bureaucratic governance led to a period of prosperity called the Pax Mongolica. Unlike Alexander, Genghis planned for his death and created a possibility of the Mongol Empire to prosper after his death. Section 3. Queen Victoria in India. Almost identical to the armies of Alexander the Great and Genghis Khan, Queen Victoria's British army was loyal to her and to the building of the British Empire. This is especially evident during the Indian Mutiny, which occurred between 1857 and 1859. This rebellion occurred for a number of reasons, but first and foremost was the fact that most people in India were unhappy because Indian civilians were not being included in the discussion of changing policies. Essentially, the people being governed had no say in how they were governed. As soon as the first shots were fired, British troops and subjects were willing to lay down their lives in order to quell the rebellion. By 1877, Queen Victoria was labeled as the Empress of India. So how does India go from a rebellion against British rule to being infatuated with the idea of Queen Victoria in a span of just 18 years? The explicit answer to this question lies in the ability of Queen Victoria to convince her subjects that they need her in order to better their lives. One of the ways Victoria bettered the lives of Indians was by introducing British feminism into India. By promoting herself as a strong, independent woman, and by endorsing those ideas in Britain, she was able to spread those ideologies to women in India. This led to many people in India seeing and understanding the value of being under the rule of the British and Queen Victoria. This is simply another example of how empire builders and rulers were able to calm their subjects by explicitly showing them how they are making the subordinate countries into a better place. Queen Victoria won the support of Indian women by making the men of India the enemy of the British crown in a sense. By supporting the feminist movement and bringing it to India, Queen Victoria sought to lessen the power of men in Britain and in India. Victoria used this as a way to gain the support of women across India, because she was supporting them in a time of need. There is nothing easy about trying to maintain and build a culturally diverse empire. The ruler of the empire has to somehow maintain control over tens of thousands of people from culturally diverse backgrounds. They have to contend with cultural differences among their subjects that inevitably cause issues. Leaders of multicultural empires begin to realize that they could subdue them by pointing out how much the empire had done for them and their counterparts, as well as showing loyalty. Leaders also use the idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend to continue to win support among their subjects. Without these two forms of coercion, the rulers of these once great empires would not have been so successful.